Okay.
The best movie I ever saw was
The best movie I ever saw, I think, was on the reflections on World War II, the Battle of Iwo Jima.
my attitude about war is
My attitude about war is that a lot of it has been unnecessary and has caused a lot of financial distress for all of the countries that have been involved. World War II, although I think it was necessary, was very costly, especially in terms of the Marshall Plan and recovering Europe. Just a plain disaster.
my favorite ethnic food to eat is
My favorite ethnic food to eat is probably gumbo, and I love to make it.
um, if I could go one place in the world that I've not been to, where would I go?
If I could go to one place in the world that I haven't been to, I think it probably would be the Grand Canyon in Colorado.
Did you go to college?
No.
If I had gone to college, I would have studied.
If I had gone to college at the time that I had entertained the thought, it probably would be a good deal different than today. I think today I would be, I would go to college for culinary arts.
If I had $10,000 to spend on one thing, what it would be?
If I had $10,000 to spend on one thing, it probably would be to equip someone who is physically disabled with a means of being able to get around and do the things that are necessary to enhance their lives.
My biggest regret is
My biggest regret, I think, is not having spent more time with my wife. I was so busy earning a living and traveling that I missed out on a lot of things, thinking that I was doing a good thing to bring my family together and survive. Looking at it, looking back at it now, I think I would have spent more time with my wife.
the best piece of advice I ever got was
The best piece of advice I ever got, I think, is don't sweat the small stuff.
the stupidest thing I've ever done was
Stupidest thing I ever done probably was getting out of the lawnmower business. I think I should have perpetuated that to a point where in a couple of years I could have sold the entire business.
if I could have dinner with anyone in the world, living or dead, that person would be.
If I could have dinner with anyone in the world, living or dead, I think it would be Mother Teresa.
My biggest fear is
My biggest fear is having to go to a nursing home in a condition where I am still aware of my surroundings and not able to do for myself. I'd like to be independent.
My very best quality is,
My very best quality, I think, would be loyalty.
I want my sons to know
I want my sons to know that I love them all equally, and I believe they're capable of whatever they pursue because they have been successful in whatever they've attempted to do. I just hope that they will learn from the lessons that I've learned, and that is to appreciate the life around them and spend more time on the things that make them happy and less on the things that are destined for financial improvement.
and if I could see my mother right now, I would tell her,
I love her.
can you do the whole thing?
I would, if I could see my mother right now, I would just tell her how much I love her.
And if I could see my father right now,
If I could see my father right now, there'd be no doubt, but I would give him a big hug and a kiss.
okay. Can you summarize your, no, let's do it differently. Tell me in about a 2-minute deal, so you need to edit, about your first 2 or 3 years of marriage to Janet. You know, you went to that nice honeymoon, and so talk about your next 2 years.
The first 2 or 3 years of my marriage to Janet were ones of a growing relationship. I remember the second winter that we were in our first apartment, and my automobile needed a lot of repair work and it lacked compression. And it was very difficult to start when it was cold. We didn't have such a thing as 5W20 oil as we have today. And in order to be able to get to work the next morning, I had to get up in the middle of the night, get out and start the car and let it warm up, and it had to be restarted about every hour and a half. So she agreed to go out every alternate time and start the car. And it just symbolized the type of relationship that was developing because it was totally shared. And she never balked in any responsibility that she had. And I remember one time, very shortly after that, when she called me one day and she said, "What time do you think you're going to be home for supper tonight?" And I said, "Probably about 5:30. And she says, "Do you realize it's 7:15 right now?" And I said, "No, I didn't," because I was working at the bench and I was learning how to repair engines, and time just escaped me. I was always involved in my work.
What were the favorite foods that she cooked for you?
I think my favorite food that Janet cooked for me was probably spaghetti, because I taught her how to cook, And that's one of the things that she really labored on, and she knew how I liked spaghetti al dente, and she wouldn't overcook it. So that was always an enjoyable thing, because we always had spaghetti with a nice salad beforehand.
And how long had you all been married before you had your first child?
About a year and a half.
So, talk about what you all went through with the birth of your first child.
After about a year and a half, shortly after the first year, Janet became pregnant, and our son was born July 21st, 1957. We were married on September the 8th, 1956. And when she started carrying Jay, who was our first child, he was 7 pounds 15 ounces when he was born, and she was quite large. And she decided that she wanted to work, and at the time she didn't realize that she was pregnant, but she went to work on a part-time basis, and I would come home at about 5:15 from work, and she worked at a Dunkin' Donuts facility and worked until 11 o'clock at night, and the policeman used to come in there and have a coffee and donut. And one of the policemen said to her, "When are you expecting?" And she said, "That's when I knew I had to stop eating donuts."
You know, I once heard a comedian said, "You never ask a woman if she's pregnant unless you see that baby coming out of her."
Right. Yeah.
And so, what was it like to be parents now?
Janet was much better equipped to be a parent than I was, as far as I was really afraid of picking up the baby. And I think the reason for it is that I wasn't overly secure standing up. And when our children were growing up, the two things that Janet and I really lacked was the ability to walk side by side. And one of the things that I lacked with the children was allowing them to walk behind me, because if they just tapped my knees, I would be down on the floor. So if they came walking behind me, even when they were small children, I would swat them away. And I know that that was a disservice to the kids, but at the same time it was a matter of survival for me. So I really felt bad about that part of it. And I think if that's the one thing that I regret, is not having been able to walk side by side with Janet, and having the kids walk behind me, comfortably behind me.
Have you ever told that to your kids?
I'm not sure I ever have. I don't know if they really were aware of the fact that I had that problem.
And so, how soon after Jay was the next child born?
Joel was born about a little over a year and a half afterwards. He was born on May the 19th, 2 years later. And he was a very good baby. He very quickly slept through the night, so that we didn't have the problem of waking up so many hours and having to take care of them. He was also a good baby, and once he was cleaned up, when he was wet or whatever, once he was cleaned up, he'd just go right back to sleep or be comfortable in his bed. He was just a very content baby.
And so, was most of your all's life at this point just spent parenting your two boys?
Really, that's about what it amounts to.
And working.
Yeah, and working.
And then, Todd was born how soon after?
Todd was born in 1964, so he was the last of the boys, and from 57 to 64, he was on the tail end of, and Janet proclaimed that this was the last one.
There's not a baby after Todd?
No, Scott was in
Oh.
between.
Say when Scott was born.
Yeah, when Scott was born, he was a big baby. And I had spoken to Janet that morning about 10 or 10:15, and she was going to the grocery store to buy some meat for our dinner that evening. And Tony, who ran the grocery store, said to her, "You look like you're about ready to deliver." And she said, "Yeah, I think it'll be a matter of a couple of days." And less than an hour later, she went into labor. And she delivered Scott like in less than an hour. So it was a very easy birth. But then during the, well, I guess about the 9th or 10th month, he had a slow motor condition, or they thought, but he was just a contented baby. She took him to a pediatrician, and he said that we were going to have difficulty with him because he was very slow. And it turns out that he was one of the wildest ones that we had. I remember one Christmas, he got I forgot what they call them, but it's a little tricycle that's very close to the ground, and he used to speed around that thing and spin around corners, and then when I got a go-kart, he was the one that spun around the neighborhood with the go-kart. And I was out to chastise him one day, and he had my snowmobile helmet on, and came up the street, and I put my hand out, and one of my neighbors took the helmet off, and he had bribed all the neighbors by telling them to get on the go-kart and ride around, and they wouldn't then complain about him. So he was smart. He was a real politician.
And so now you had 4 boys. Tell me about your marriage and what you all did now with 4 boys.
One of the things that I realized is I worked long hours, and I had to pay attention to the fact that Janet had to get out of the house frequently. So usually we would try to get out to dinner on a Tuesday evening, and then Saturday evenings we would generally go out to a friend's house. And we had a group of friends that once a month we would have a party at one of the people's houses, and then about every 5th or 6th week we would have a party at our house. And then as the group grew, it got to be like 8 weeks before we'd have another party at our house. So it became more financially manageable that way, because all we had to do is to bring a particular food, like potluck suppers and things like that. And then we expanded, and we got into an ecumenical group where we had one religion that was represented at all of the get-togethers that we had, and we got to know what other religions were, and we got to know the people. You could put a name with a face, and we had that was a very enjoyable period in our lives, I think, because we got to know people of other persuasions, and we got to appreciate the fact that there isn't one solitary religion, that we can appreciate the fact that others have different views than we do in terms of religion.
You said that you and Janet had one fight in 44 years of marriage? Mm-hmm. Tell me about that one fight.
I had gone to work for the R.E. Jarvis Company, and they were located in Brookline, Mass. At the time. And we lived in Brighton, Mass for about a little over a year and a half, and then we moved to Foxborough and lived with my brother-in-law and sister-in-law for about a little over a year while she went to finish her doctorate. And after that, we saved enough money to buy our own home in Milford, Massachusetts. And one night, after I had gone to work for R.E. Jarvis Company, we had a meeting, and I had become service manager by that time, about the third year I was with the company. And we had a meeting that was scheduled to last till about 9 o'clock. And after the 9 o'clock hour, we decided that we would go out and get a bite to eat. So I suggested to one of the guys that I'll call my wife and tell her that I'm going to be delayed. And he called her and told her that I'd be leaving in about an hour and be home probably by 10:30. Well, it took us over an hour to get waited on, and I never thought anything about it. I walked into the house that night and came in. It was a two-level house, and the stairway came to a landing and then curved and went up the other way, and she was standing at the top of the top of the level when I walked in, and she looked down at me and she said, "Where have you been? It's 5 minutes to 12. I expected you a couple of hours ago." And I said, "Well, I don't know why, because I told Phil that I was going to call you and tell you that we were going to be delayed. You said you'd be home in an hour and a half, and here it is, 5 minutes to 12. I want a divorce." She said, "I didn't get married to be by myself." And I said, "What in the world are you talking about?" So we stayed up that night until about 2 o'clock in the morning discussing it. And I said, "Look, as far as I'm concerned, I wasn't responsible for this, and I'm going to have Phil call you in the morning and explain it to you, because I'm not the one that did it." So when I went into work the next day, I said, "Phil, you call my wife and tell her what you did last night, because," and I told him what the outcome was. So when I got home that evening, she had a meal prepared for me, and she was well over it. That's the last time that we had a real argument. But when we got married, I made a pact with her that we would never go to bed mad at each other. And if we had anything that we questioned about each other, we just sat up until we got it thrashed out, and we went to bed without any ill thoughts of each other on it.
Do you want to talk about her death or not?
Can, if you want to. It's up to you.
Let's do that.
Janet was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and I called the boys, and she had talked to a couple of the boys also, and we invited them to come down and be here when she was going to have the operation. And I frankly was more optimistic about the surgery than she was. She was very apprehensive about it. The doctor was very misleading, I think, in terms of the diagnosis of the brain tumor that she had. She had a non-malignant, what they call a meningioma, which is a tumor of the brain which is not non-cancerous. And the way it was described to us, it was about the size of an egg and about the thickness of an egg, with the yolk being the higher part in the center. And he thought that all he'd have to do is to open up her skull, detach it, and take it out and then sew her up again, which would probably take about an hour. And we went through all of the process, and I looked it up on the computer and so forth, and I was quite happy with the original diagnosis. When she had the operation, it took about an hour longer. But when the doctor told us about it, he opened her up, and they started trimming the tumor, and it was a very spongy material, very hard material. And they decided that they had to remove the entire tumor. And it was the size of a baseball instead of being flat like an egg. So when they took it out, there was one small artery that was below it. And he had to take an instrument and dislodge that. And he thought that if he cut through it and it started to bleed, it was all over. So finally, I guess it had just sort of stuck by compression, and he was able to dislodge it and took it out. And initially she was able to communicate really well and had movement in her left arm. By the next day, she had lost all movement from her shoulder to the tips of her fingers. Although she said she did have sensation in her hand. She was aware of the fact that this was her left hand, and she was left-handed. She wrote everything with her left hand. She expressed a very deep emotion over the loss of her arm, and was not at all optimistic about her future. Initially, I had difficulty communicating anything that would help her overcome this anxiety that she had. And I visited her every day for extended periods while she was in the hospital. And then she came home and had to go back to the different hospital at this time, which was Willis Knight Medical Center. And she was there about a week and a half. It was just before Mother's Day. And we had an appointment with the doctors on that Wednesday to review her case. And the doctor came through, and the nurse came in and told us that it would be about 5 minutes before the doctor came. And the doctor appeared at the door, and he had the papers in his hand, and he said, "Oh, this is Janet Lamoth. We don't have a lot of hope for her, so we're not going to spend any time on it," and continued on. And I was not only flabbergasted, but I was astounded that any doctor would make that kind of a statement. And a few minutes later, the social worker came in and said, "Your wife has to be discharged tomorrow, and I want you to make financial arrangements to take care of that." And I said, "Wait a minute, she's not going to be able to come home. It's, you know, well, she'll have to go to a nursing home, so you'll have to make arrangements for that." I said, "How in the world am I going to make arrangements for that quick?" And I turned around and I just was so infuriated. I told her, I said, "Look, Sunday is Mother's Day. And as far as I'm concerned, she's going to be in here for Mother's Day, and she can be discharged after that, but she's not leaving here an hour before that." And she stormed out of the room and she said, "Well, we'll see about that." She came back a few minutes later and she said, "You must know somebody here because they said there would be no problem." When I left the hospital that day, I was trying to rack my brain as to what I was going to do to find a nursing home that quickly, and whether or not they would accept her. And I didn't have the finances that would take care of such an extended stay. So I sat down and was thinking about it that night. And the one person that came to mind was the girl that was in charge of Easter seals. And I knew that she knew a lot of people. So I called Susan Loftus and I asked her for a recommendation on a nursing home. And she said, well, I just happen to know this Pat Covington, and she's in charge of the IHS nursing home. She said, I'll have her call you at 9 tomorrow morning. So she called me the next morning, and I talked to Pat, and she said, well, I'll come to the hospital and see your wife this afternoon. I said, what time? About 1 o'clock? She said, why don't we make it comfortable around 2 o'clock? And that'll give you time to let her have dinner and get cleaned up and so forth. I said, okay. So she came down promptly at 2 and spoke to Janet for a few minutes, and she said, okay. And I said, what do you mean, okay? You're going to accept her? Accept her? And she said, yes. And it was just such a relief that I said, well, I'm going to go down and take a look at the place. And I went down that afternoon and looked at it, and then I went back again about 7 o'clock after the shift changed, and I wanted to make sure that they were taking care of patients. And the nurse that was on night duty, I spoke to her, and I said, what is the percentage of Caucasian and minorities? And she looked at me and she said, the majority of them are minorities. And I looked around and everybody was well taken care of, and I spoke to a few of the patients and they all seemingly were happy with the place. So I made arrangements with Pat to have Janet taken there. So they picked her up on Monday and brought it down, and I followed them in my vehicle, and they brought her in, and Pat made sure that she had a room directly across from her office. And then she said, I know that you had your computer at the hospital. She said, I'll have a plug put in so you can use the computer down there. And she did, and I was able to document everything right at the hospital, or at the nursing home. And I got to know all of the patients down there, and all of the various people that worked on the different shifts. So one of Janet's friends from Massachusetts came down to visit her, and she stayed overnight at the hotel downtown. And at the time, construction was going on in the city of Shreveport. And the streets were in such disrepair that they had rerouting everywhere. And it was not easy to give somebody from out of town directions on how to find the hotel. So I told this lady to follow me, and I'd show her how to get down there, and I drove into the yard and parked my vehicle, got out. And she came over to me and she said, is that the best you could do? And I said, what do you mean? She said, is that the best you could do for a nursing home for Janet? And I said, I still don't understand what you're talking about. She says, an awful lot of black people there. I lost it. I said, you know, when she was in therapy, half of the people there were minorities, and half of the people that were taken care of were minorities. And she feels very comfortable with them. And as far as I'm concerned, they give wonderful care and they give wonderful food. And I said, what more do we need? When I turned around and got back in my car and came home, I still to this day can't understand how people are that way. I just, not. We live in a minority neighborhood, and some of my best friends have been minority. So I just because she came from Massachusetts and we have very few minorities up there, she's just not understanding at all. So Janet was very well taken care of there till she was in the hospital about 10 months, and the physical therapist was in a wheelchair also. He's a paraplegic, I'm sorry. And he was the first person in a wheelchair to cross the United States, and is documented in the Guinness Book of World Records. And I talked to him about bringing Janet home. So we worked 2 months in getting to be able to get her in and out of the car safely, and how to load and unload her wheelchair and get her and take her. And I brought her home, and she was home for 2 months, and I took care of her 24/7, with the exception of about 2 days where I had relief. And then we had to go to therapy, and people wondered how I was able to get her in and out of the car for therapy. But yet we managed, and I never had any difficulty. I've always believed that the good Lord never gives you a load you can't carry. And it was, we were getting ready for bed one night, and Janet said she had a real pain in her foot. And I said, well, I'll give you some Tylenol to relieve the pain. And I gave her the Tylenol and went to bed, and about 1:30 in the morning she said she wanted to go to the emergency room. And I said, if we go to the emergency room, you're going to be there until 8 or 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. There's no sense in even going. So when we wake up in the morning, I'll get you showered, and we'll get down there and let you get looked at. So we went down the next day, and they diagnosed it. She had a blood clot in the bottom of her foot, and it was starting to show red on the instep of her foot. And within about 2 or 3 days, the redness was really gone way up, and she had a tremendous amount of pain. So she was put on some pretty hefty medications. And by Wednesday of that week, it had gone probably about 8 inches beyond her ankle. And the doctor that was looking after her at that time said that it was necessary to do an amputation. And I didn't want him to do it because I didn't know him. He did not have a lot of experience. So I called a friend of mine who I had worked with when I was with the New Horizons Independent Living Center, and had him as a speaker. So I called him on the phone and asked him to come up and give me a secondary opinion. And he came up and looked at it, and he said he could take care of it. And so he said, do you want me to do it? And I said, talk to her. She's the one that's going to make the decision, not me. And he talked to her and told her that it was either life or death, that either she had it done or it was going to poison her system. And that it had gone as far as he would recommend going, didn't want it to wait too long. So she decided to have it done, and the following day they did the amputation. And she was in the hospital about 10 days later, and I visited her every day. And then one day I had just finished my sandwich, a fact, I had one more bite of the sandwich when the phone rang, and I answered the phone, and it was the hospital nurse, and she said that Janet had thrown up, and that she seemed to be fine, but was I coming down to see her? And I said, yeah. And she said, well, I just wanted you to know, be aware of what was going on, that she wasn't feeling well. She had gone to therapy that morning, came back, had lunch, and shortly after lunch she said she felt bad. So I told the girl I would be right down. So I left here and drove down to the hospital, parked my vehicle, and wheeled up into the elevator. And as soon as the elevator opened, I saw 4 nurses standing there. And one of the nurses said, we did all we could. And I said, you did all you could. She's not dead. And they said, yes, I'm afraid she is. And I said, oh my God. She had a blood clot, and it went directly to her heart. And then the doctor that was attending her was at the hospital, and he said, asked if there was anything he could do. And I said to him, I don't think so. If he couldn't do it before then, there was no help then. So the nurse said, do you have people that you want me to call? And I had my printed list in my pocket of all of the telephone numbers that I call people frequently. And I just highlighted the ones that I wanted her to call. And she called all of my sons for me. And the only thing that I can say is that the priest from our parish gave her the last rites the day before. I was so grateful for that. When I told the priest that, it just made me very comfortable to know that she had been taken care of. But it was a very difficult time. And my son up in Massachusetts wanted to have a full service up there with viewing and all, which duplicated what we had down here, and I told him that I just didn't think I could go through it. And I said, if you want to do it, you make all of the arrangements and transfer her body from here up there, and I'll go up. And we did this. We did that, but he took care of the funeral arrangements. I just couldn't handle it. And then after the funeral was done up there, we had her cremated, and then about a week later, we went up and buried her ashes and had a very small but limited funeral there. She's buried in the same cemetery as my mother and father. A beautiful tombstone, and we'll be buried side by side. So, but it's something that I went through. I think after the funeral, I was pretty well resigned to the fact that she was in a much better place. And knowing that she had limited strength in her left arm, and having an amputation, the good Lord knew that it was not going to be easy for her. He said it's better to go where she was going. And I've resigned myself to that fact, which made it a lot easier to deal with in the aftermath of her demise. It was not an easy time, and I try not to reflect on it too much now, because it is can still be very troublesome. But I'm very grateful for the time that I was able to spend with her, and I hope that I made up for the time that I lost during our marriage because of traveling and all the other things. I take care of her. I think the good Lord gave strength to do that. certainly gained a lot of friends through that ordeal with the people who assisted me throughout that time. Telephone calls and all the other support that I had was very, very helpful.
Let's break. Thank you.
My older brother, Eddie, was very ambitious and probably had as much ability, much natural ability as anybody I've ever seen. Had a lot of promise, and he worked in the construction business and really taught himself how to read blueprints, and was a master mason, a master carpenter. He bought my grandfather's house, which was the one that was in the William Howard Taft family, and the foundation was eroding. And how he did it, I have no earthly idea, but he took a beam, an I-beam, that was 18 inches in height, and got it into the house and stationed in such a way and elevated the house without cracking a brick on that old house, and redid the foundation, and then proceeded to rebuild the kitchen in a style that he wanted his wife to have. And he got about 3/4 of the way through that and got diverted into building a bank in Wellesley, Mass. For a construction company, and the guy had given him all kinds of promises of what he would do, profit sharing wise and all of the other things. I mean, it really like a pie in the sky type of thing. And about 10 months later, he even had an automobile that he drove for the company. And about 8 or 9 months later, it just, a lot of the things that he promised just failed to materialize. And my brother, I think, probably started drinking about that time. And today he is in a city that neighbors Newport Richey, Florida, in a nursing home, and walks across the street every day to get a couple of beers, and really has got the beginning of Alzheimer's. My sister goes down to visit him quite often because she lives in Newport Richey, and she said he is just as mean as ever.
And tell me, in kind of a 1-minute summary, what he was like growing up with you.
Growing up, he and I would get together with all of the other kids in the neighborhood. We had Robert and Johnny and the Wagner and Gordon Butler, and perhaps a couple of other kids in the neighborhood that we used to grow up with. And it seemed as though every time I got into some type of a confrontation with somebody, he would egg them on rather than try to support me. And Gordon Butler was another one of the neighboring kids, and he said to me one day, when one of these guys bullies you, just just punch him on the side of the mouth and run like hell. Because I was small, but I was fast. So one of the kids hit me in the thigh with an apple when we were down in the apple orchard one day, and I didn't do anything about it. About 5 minutes later, he hit me another time, and this time it really sunk, and I guess probably the part of the apple was sharp, and it really hurt. And I turned around and just belted him one on the side of the mouth, and tears came to his eyes, and I went to run, and I was frozen right there. And he didn't do anything about it, but he became my best friend afterwards. So while it was probably good advice, it was surely not good at that particular time because I was frightened to death.
And tell me just one more sentence about Billy at growing up with Billy.
With Eddie, you mean?
Eddie, I mean.
I'm sorry. Yeah, growing up with Eddie was, we were very close because we worked on the farm together. And he drove the tractor and I drove the mowing machine, and I rode the hay rake when he was pulling it. And when we were harrowing the fields, I worked on whatever implement that we were pulling. Harvesting potatoes, I ran the potato digger, for example.
And how was Billy in all of that?
And
Eddie, excuse me.
Eddie was very industrious, and he was able to do just about anything. I mean, he ran that tractor like an old pro. So when he turned 16, he got his license without any hitches at all, and my grandfather gave him his automobile when he turned 16. So it's something that my grandfather never did for anybody else. I guess he was enamored with my brother Eddie.
And who's next in line? You're next in line.
Next in line I was.
And who's third in line?
Then my sister Jean is next in line, and she grew up with extended teeth. We used to call them buck teeth, and she was a very friendly person, still is to this day, and she had a lot of friends. So the thing that I find about Jean is that I always loved her and she always loved me ever since we were grown up. And we, the four girls, of course we had to entertain ourselves. We didn't have any form of entertainment. And I remember we had one thing that the girls used to do would be a game called Fly Girls, and I don't even remember the details of it now, but they had some type of a cape that they would wear and run with it, and the capes would fly up into the air, and they just had a great time with it. My sister reminded me of that a couple of years ago when she was visiting here, and after she got married, she went in and had her teeth altered, and she has a very nice set of teeth today because of the work that they did on her. And she also had a problem with her jaw because of the teeth not being properly configured, and she had to have her jaw wired for about a period while that was being altered, and that has proved to be really, really well done today.
And then, is Claire next?
Yeah, Claire is next. My sister Claire was a girl that was destined to be a nurse. And the surprising thing of it is that she decided to go to school at the Framingham College, Framingham Hospital School of Nursing. The girl that was the administrator there and became the teacher of all of the nurses lived across the street from our church. She knew my mother, or got to know my mother, and when my sister went to school there, she took a liking to my sister, but that was a very thin-veiled disguise, because she really made her toe the mark. And as a consequence, she became probably the best nurse out of that entire class, and she became a supervising nurse and worked in many hospitals and nursing homes before she retired. And one of the nursing homes was failing in Florida, and she brought the nursing home back. And the administrator of that nursing home went to another nursing home and wanted to take her out of retirement. And she went to work for him and brought that nursing home back. And then she retired. He called her again to go to work for another one, and she said no, she wasn't going to do that again.
And what was Claire like growing up?
Claire was rather snippy, but she was one of those that knew exactly what direction she was going in all the time, and there was no altering her one way or the other. She knew exactly what she was going to do.
And then who's next?
Gloria, my sister Gloria was a girl who figured that everybody owed her a living, and she wanted to be the princess. And I remember one time when my father elevated the house and created 4 rooms upstairs, each of the girls got a room of their own. And she got up one morning and put her clothes out at the outside, thinking that my mother would do her laundry for her. And my mother says, I think you got something mistaken here, because if you think I'm going to do your laundry for you, you got another thing coming. And she got married to a fellow who was perhaps her match, is the best way we can put it. But he would visit my mother and father when they got married, and after having a meal, he'd say, well, I'm going to go upstairs and have a nap for a couple of hours, and he proceeded to do that. And he told her that, for example, he would pass an insane hospital, and he says, this is where I'm going to come and visit you in a couple of years. And he practically drove her nuts, until finally one day she said she had planned to divorce him. And she made all of the plans and finally divorced him and got half of the house, which at that time had gone from a very, well, they had paid the house off after their 25th wedding anniversary. And I guess it was a couple of years after that that she got the divorce, and the cost of houses had escalated, and she got half of the value of the house, plus part of his retirement. And even though she went out with another fellow after that, who was quite a few years older than she was, she never did get married. And up until the time of her death, she continued to get the retirement from her husband. So everything that all the grief that he caused her was paid off in spades.
And then I guess you've got a brother next, don't you?
No, my sister Mary is the next one, is the final girl. And Mary was the youngest girl. She was born on Memorial Day weekend, and I remember as a child, she was always had a lot of energy, and she had always had a lot of friends who were very, very good-looking girls. And I remember when I was about 15 years old, she used to bring these girls home. And there was one girl that told me when my mother passed away that she had a mad crush on me when she was visiting the house. And I said, I wish you'd have told me about it, because I never knew. She was a real pretty girl. In fact, she's about 64, 65 years old now, and she's still a very pretty girl. She's had an artificial hip installed a couple of years ago, and her husband passed away after a period of declining health. So, but she still has maintained her appearance.
And then who's the next brother?
Next one is my brother Paul. And my brother Paul was in the construction business. He went to Boys Trade High School in Worcester, Massachusetts, and learned the trade there, and worked for a couple of people, and then he finally went into work for himself. And then after working for himself a few years, he earning a meager living, because he and I both had the same attributes in terms of running a business. We're just too kind to people, and you can't be that way when you're running a business. So he finally went to teaching at Keefe Vocational School in Framingham, Massachusetts, and they would teach in the classroom one week, and then they train out in the field. And he did very well at that training, and then to supplement his income, he would do remodeling jobs at night. And one of the things that he did, he was working up on the roof of some house and put the ladder up and climbed up on the ladder, and the ladder shifted and he went about 25 feet down and banged his head, and then had to have a shunt put in his head, and still wears that to this day. And he's 10 years younger than I am, so he's about 68 years old, and he has lost practically all of his memory. And his wife said that he is not improving. And I try to talk to him about at least once a month. Either he calls me or I call him. And he and I would meet frequently, and every time I visited in Massachusetts, we would sit down and play cribbage together and challenge each other. And he said, well, last time I beat you about 5 games, and I said, no, I beat you 4-2 or something like that, and we always argue about who's the winner of all the previous games. But
And what was Paul like growing up?
Paul was very mischievous. I think a lot. He reminded me a lot of myself when I was younger, because he was get along with a bunch of guys. And in fact, one night they were out on the Hopedale Airport, and they were running back and forth on the airport, which they shouldn't have been there at all. And every once in a while they put their lights on, and he saw this car coming directly at them, and they hit head on. And he went through the windshield and cracked his head open. And so my mother had to retrieve that call one night when he was in the hospital and admitted to the emergency room for that accident. He got over it, but I don't think he ever really got over it that well, because I think it perhaps damaged his brain prior to the injury, and helped to sustain the lack of memory that he has today.
And then your youngest brother?
Youngest brother, Gerard, was born in April, the year that I had polio, and he was about 6 months old, and he was in a crib in the same room that I was in when I had polio. And I remember my mother bringing him to the hospital to visit me when I guess it was right after Christmas that year, and she brought the 2 boys down, and we had they had to put them out on the porch that was adjacent to the hospital, because they couldn't come into the communicable disease hospital. And I went out there in the wheelchair and visited with them for about an hour and a half, and that was about a month before I was discharged from the hospital. And my brother Paul was about 11 or 12 years old at the time, and I remember picking him up and putting him in my lap, and he was not completely accepting of the wheelchair, because he didn't know what that was like at the time.
And so what was Gerard like as a young brother, your youngest brother?
Gerard was, as he grew up, he was getting to be about 10 or 12 years old when I left home. And I really never got to know him that well until after we grew up. And he went away to college at the University of Massachusetts, and I kept in touch with him. And then he needed some work one summer, and I was running the lawnmower business at this time. I was running it on a part-time basis. And I decided that I probably would open the business up full-time and hired him to run it for me until I came back in the evening. And he operated it for about 3 or 4 months. And then I told him that we would never have any secrets, and that if he was ever unhappy to talk to me about it, because I wasn't going to let that come between our relationship. So I came home from work one night, and he said he wanted to talk to me, and he didn't quite know how to do it. And I reminded him of the original agreement that we had, that I wouldn't let anything disturb our relationship. So he said he was thinking of going back to school, and I encouraged him, and he said he wanted to give me a 2-week notice so he could have a vacation. And at that time, the arrangement that we had was I give him a percentage of the billing, especially on the parts that we sold, and a portion of the labor. But those invoices had to be paid first. When the invoices were paid, I calculated his salary on that arrangement. So he had quite a good billing that month, and he went away on vacation for 2 weeks, and then when he came back, I handed him a check. And he looked at it, and he almost changed his mind about going back to school because he had done really well. But after he went back to school, I resumed a part-time basis on the business, and it continued to flourish because I had about 155 lawnmowers under tarps for repairs. And one day I went down to one of the local merchants to pick up parts that I didn't normally carry, and I asked him how business was, and he only had 2 lawnmowers down there going in to be repaired and 3 going out. And I didn't tell him the number of lawnmowers that I had. When I first started the business originally, there was...
Well, let's wait. We'll talk about your business. This is
Okay.
just about Gerard.
Oh, okay.
And Gerard now, this day and age?
And Gerard went to college, and I got him a job while he was going to college with Taft Oil out of Holyoke, Mass. And he worked for them running their power equipment division for about 2 years. And then he decided that he was going to move to New Hampshire, and he moved to New Hampshire. And I can't remember what his first job was up there, but he is now working for himself. He's done an assortment of jobs, but basically in the reconstruction business, reconstructing homes.